Can you hear me? All right, so I'll start. Our results indicate that public opposition to any further migration from predominantly Muslim states is widespread. Europe has one unified decision. This is from the Chatham House. Because I find no alternative to the statement, I affirm resolved Europe should impose harder restrictions on immigration. I'll set some scopes for the debate. I would say the harder restrictions on immigration is a temporary ban on Muslim immigration until public opinion is moderate. I have one definition, and that should, according to Merriam-Webster, is used to indicate what is probable. Thus, the resolution indicates whether or not harder restrictions on Europe are probable, and on the side of the affirmation, I say that it's probable. I have three main contentions that I'll advocate for in today's round. The first is that Muslims pose a threat to Europe and have no social standing or economic standing within the country. Insofar as 10 countries have already said an outright ban on Muslims is the best thing to do for Europe, they advocate for the idea that Muslims pose no economic standing within their nation and only qualified Muslims should actually be allowed to enter. The second contention I'm going to elaborate on is Europeans pose a threat to immigrants. Insofar as the majority of immigrants are in fact Muslim, the widespread fear of Islamophobia has led to recent outbreaks of attacks against Muslims, and insofar as we see a lot of these people being attacked because of their heritage, there's a direct threat to immigrants entering the country. And the third contention I'm going to elaborate on is that Muslim immigrants leaving the Islam community leave their positions disenfranchised because men are predominantly the immigrants that are leaving the positions, and insofar as men are the heads of households, the Islam community dies. But this is even more important because European countries only want Muslims that are qualified and have some sort of economic standing. This leads to the famous hypothesis of the brain exodus, where the best of the best are leaving the Islam community and moving towards Europe, which leaves Europe with a serious threat of more Muslims within their country, increases Islamophobia, while also decreasing the amount of political and economic participation of Muslims. Those three contentions will be elaborated on as I go throughout my case, and with that, I'll pass the mic.
Okay, now before I go into this, are you making any policy regarding refugees, or is this simply regarding economic immigration?
So this is going to be refugees, because that's predominantly what the immigration is regarding.
Sorry, one more then. So is this policy specific to refugees, or are you including both?
For the purposes, because it's widespread racism, I would say it's both immigrants as well as refugees.
All right, with that said, I have a major point to go into about that then. The first overall disadvantage I have to my opponent's case is that asylum is incredibly different from economic immigration. Let's begin with a definition of that from the Open Society Foundations, which defines, quote, "A migrant is a person who leaves home to seek a new life in another region or country. A refugee is someone fleeing war, persecution, or natural disaster. Refugee status is defined in international law, which requires states to protect refugees and not send anyone to a place where they risk being persecuted or seriously harmed," end quote. The Office of Migration and Home Affairs at the EU further explains this, saying, quote, "Asylum is granted to people fleeing persecution or serious harm in their own country and therefore in need of international protection. Asylum is a fundamental right. Granting it is an international obligation first recognized in the 1951 Geneva Convention on the Protection of Refugees," end quote. So ultimately, what my opponent is doing by predominantly focusing on Muslims and refugees is that he is violating an internationally recognized human right to be able to have the right to life, which is ultimately what is at stake here. That's why they're fleeing from their home countries. The majority of Muslim refugees are coming from Syria, Iran, and what they're doing is they are fleeing from places where they are at threat of death. So my opponent is violating their human rights by putting this policy into place. Now, I think it's important to understand the total immigration numbers here. There are 4.7 million migrants, and only 500,000 of them are coming from the Middle East and claiming refugee status. So this is only about 1/10 of total immigration to Europe. Now, I'm going to turn it back over to my opponent just so he can clarify what he's doing with his case here, and then I will get more into the meat of immigration as a whole. But first, I want to hear this whole thing about refugees and this Muslim ban specifically.
So basically what the resolution asks is Europe should impose harder restrictions on immigration. Now, the general statement, harder restrictions on immigration, is very broad, right? I can't just say, you know what, let's make it harder for immigrants to come in. There's various types of immigrants. They all have different situations. So again, I'm going to go back to that definition of should. Should indicates probability. The most probable thing that Europe is going to do is continuing their Muslim ban, which has been started by 10 countries because of the Chatham House report in 2017. This was essentially instantiated after President Trump started the Muslim ban within the United States, and 10 European countries said they would also like a ban on asylum seekers, or as you're going to refer to them, refugees. What I would say the harder restriction is that this should no longer be just asylum seekers and asylum seekers and refugees, but all Muslim migrants, because of the fact of the idea that they get unfairly treated when they go to the European countries, as well as them not having standing within the community, and then the brain exodus. So I'm going to directly go down this idea of why we should have this harder restrictions on immigration, specifically relating to Muslims, with the first idea being that several European countries have already taken a stance to do so. Insofar as Sweden saw a death by a stabbing incident because of an asylum seeker who was denied access to the country, Sweden started to impose harsher restrictions on these asylum seekers. Specifically, and I quote, they say, current regulations require sponsors to demonstrate only that they can support themselves. Permanent residency for asylum seekers under the age of 25 would restrict to those who have completed high school and must show ability to support themselves. Furthermore, in the UK, they found that there have been a total of 3,000 children who have been prevented entry into the United Kingdom. And a spokeswoman says the process was halted in 2011 due to systematic deficiencies within the UK system. And this was furthered in Italy, where Chief of Police Franco Garibelli said has called for detention and deportation of migrants and refugees, who blames them for instability and threats within the country. This has also been seen in France between December 2014 and July 2016, when there were over 4 terrorist attacks carried out by Muslim immigrants, and they found that this has actually been targets within Belgium, Germany, Russia, and Spain, and because of this, they also saw a terrorist attack within Istanbul. So for this majority reason, the most important statistic I'm going to provide is the idea from the Chatham House, who found that 55% of people in the 10 European countries surveyed said they want to stop all future immigration from Muslim countries. Only 25% said that they did not know, and only 10% said they had an outright disagreement with the ban. Because we do what's probable, we agree with the European people and do what's in their best interest.
My first response to my opponent's case is that it is entirely based on populism. His fundamental contention is that because a lot of Europeans don't like Muslims, therefore we shouldn't let Muslims into the country. Well, this is populist. It doesn't matter what most people think, if that's a moral wrong or if it isn't a logically correct position in the first place. That's just weighing into the whims of people who could be wrong. That's not a reason to base a policy off of at all. Now, let's talk about some actual reasons to base policy off of. I'm going to look at 2 of them. The first is going to be that of the economy, and the second is going to be that of demographics. So first, for the point of the economy, let's talk about what could be benefited or harmed with regards to the economy. Now, let's see here, let me grab this, where is this? Ian Golden, Oxford University professor and expert on immigration, says that, quote, refugees represent both and a long-term investment. In the short term, it provides stimulus to the economy, which will grow about 0.2% faster than it would have without. In the long term, there is a situation with one of the lowest fertility rates in the world in Germany, and that will be vital for the long-term sustainability for the German economy, end quote. And that actually leads to the second point, which was that of population. According to Forbes, quote, if Western Europe wants to keep its benefits, the countries of the EU are going to need more workers. No place in the world has an older population than Europe. No wonder policy planners are doing what they can to encourage immigration. With fertility rates expected to hit 0 in Europe in the next decade, the only way the European Union can fight elderly poverty is to increase immigration, end quote. Now, I'm going to add one more point in response to my opponent's case, which is that of zero solvency. Now, my opponent is passing a plan which is, first of all, a violation of asylum claims, So it would be struck down by international courts simply on that basis, as I already showed evidence that it is a violation of that. But more than that, if he's specifically focusing it at Muslims, it's even worse. There's absolutely no way that this Muslim ban that he's proposing is going to be adopted in international courts. We already saw this happen in the United States when President Trump had a disguised Muslim ban. He wasn't even explicitly calling it a Muslim ban like my opponent is calling it. This Muslim ban, there will be absolutely no way that this would make it through international courts. My opponent can't fiat the United Nations. He can't fiat international courts. He has absolutely no solvency because there's no way he's going to get a Muslim ban through. That just doesn't make any sense. But even if he was to get it through, we'll create a double binder. Even if he was, that's still a terrible option for the two reasons that I talked about. We lose the economic benefits that they're able to bring, and we lose the population demographics that Europe so needs from bringing in immigration. And most importantly, you violate human rights. You're banning them on the basis of their religion. This is a terrible plan. Absolutely no way we should consider this.
So I'm going to go through the first issues. And first is all this rhetoric that it can't be done. First of all, it can be, and that's on the ideas that European Union countries have the ability to restrict refugee immigration based on the idea that they do what's best for their people. Insofar as states or countries can advocate for the idea that refugees don't have a net gain within their society, they can say that they're no longer able to take refugees because they can't provide a safe haven. So in terms of solvency, or the way this is implemented, is that countries simply state that by adopting asylum seekers, first of all, they don't have opportunities for them. And second of all, because the people within their own country are struggling, there's no way they can take on additional refugees. But that's just going to go down to your evidence, where I'll tell you about the problems with your Oxford evidence. So the first idea that you brought up is the idea that populism is a wrong. And I would agree. You can't just take all the ideas of the people and say, we don't want Muslims in our country, let's stop it. But the reason why we need to do this is my second contention, and that's the idea of Islamophobia. So after the terrorist attacks that took place in France, Italy, Sweden, and Germany, after immigrants and refugees have entered their country, there has been an increased amount of persecution of Muslim immigrants. Insofar as the New York Times wrote, there were 17 terrorist attacks perpetrated by self-identifying Muslims in the EU last year, but there were 65 acts of terrorism against Muslims, which is three to four more times as many in 2014 alone. In Germany, there were 800 attacks against refugees, a 400% increase. And also we saw in France, there have been more than 400 anti-Muslim hate crimes, representing a 223% increase, according to the French National Human Rights Commission, since July 2015. He also found that when the Paris attacks occurred, there was 878 reported Muslim attacks in the city, anti-Muslim attacks in the city alone. The reason why we cannot let Muslim immigrants within the European nation is that they themselves are proven a harm. The reason why they cannot enter is the anti-Muslim sentiments are at an all-time high, and for the safety and protection of them, there is no way that we can allow them into a country where they are going to be persecuted just because of their heritage. But then I'm going to go down to your evidence, where you first read Oxford and you say that refugees promote short-term and long-term growth. First of all, I ask you to post this evidence or explain it in your next speech, because what you will find is that it's not referring to asylum seekers, but rather specialized workers who promote some kind of balance within the state. But most important is the idea that the country has to be ready to accept Muslims, has to be ready to accept these kind of refugees. Your evidence is broad scoped on the idea that refugees in general promote economic stability. I would agree, but in this case, because I've narrowed the scope of the debate, it's specifically going to be on Muslim refugees, and because we only allow specialized refugees as seen in France and Italy, we no longer see the same kind of world.
All right, so first of all, my opponent continually in his rhetoric continues to point out the fact that this is literally a Muslim ban. There is absolutely no way this is getting through international courts. Absolutely none. There's simply no way. If they can't even get through American courts, and American courts don't even have the same level of stringency on this as the international courts would, there's simply no way his policy is getting through. He explained that countries would do it on their own. Okay, well, countries are going to be struck down in international courts. There's a reason why his plan hasn't been passed yet, and it's because it would violate the internationally accepted human right to be able to claim asylum, which is recognized in the Geneva Convention. You simply can't do this. My opponent has no solvency whatsoever, and even if he did have solvency, it's a terrible plan. That's not something you want to do. You don't want to violate internationally recognized human rights, especially and the thing is, his plan even goes further than that. It isn't even talking just about asylum claimees. It's talking about Muslims in general. There's absolutely no way that this plan gets through international courts. My opponent has zero solvency, none whatsoever, and a terrible disadvantage against him. He talked about Islamophobia and how Islamophobia is the reason why we need to pass his plan. Well, I have three responses. My first response is out of what percentage? What percentage of refugees are being hurt? Obviously, it's too many, however many it is, but what percentage is this? Is it over 50% of refugees are being killed? Because if so, I mean, maybe he has an argument, but that leads to my second response, which is that of it's their choice. The reason they're coming to Europe is because they want this. That's up to them, not up to, we don't ban them from coming because we don't allow them to make their own choice. That makes no sense. Let them ban themselves if they don't want that. If it's so bad, let them go. But that's where it leads to the third problem, which is the reason they come. The reason they come is they are fleeing from war-torn areas. They are refugees claiming asylum. You can't send them back into that, even if my opponent is right that the vast majority of them are being murdered in Europe. If they go back to Syria, it's even worse. This is not a reason to ban them at all. This is their choice. They chose to come here because it's better for them. Now, the last thing he talked about was how refugees don't actually benefit host economies, and he talked about how my evidence wasn't specific to this. Well, let's read some more evidence. Actually, let's talk about Sweden, because he had mentioned Sweden. According to The Independent, quote, immigration has helped fuel Sweden's biggest economic boom in 5 years. New figures from the Swedish government have shown that the policy saw the country take in more refugees per capita than any other in Europe, and it helped lower unemployment rates by increased spending for asylum seekers from war-torn countries like Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The move helped the Nordic region's largest economy expand 4.5%, the most in 5 years. Michael Clemens, a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, says, quote, there's not any credible research that I know of that in the medium and long term that refugees...
All right, so what's going to be most important is this idea of international courts, right? You say that this will all be struck down, but the problem is that it's happened right now and it hasn't been stopped. Right? I first tell you in Sweden, they restricted Muslim immigration entirely because they said unless you can support yourself, they're going to deny entry, and they restricted 120,000 asylum seekers from entering the country. No international court struck it down. In the UK, they called for the detention and deportation of all current Muslim immigrants, and they said because it's systematic deficiencies, no international court had a problem. In Italy, Chief Police Franco Gabriel called for detention and deportation of migrants just for instability and threats. Not an international court struck it down, right? So the problem is now is that this is happening in Europe, and your evidence, you don't have any evidence because you're saying international courts would strike it down. But the problem is not a single international court struck it down. So insofar as I tell you that 3 big European countries have taken action against Muslims, identifying plausible reasons as to why, and there hasn't been any backlash or outreach by the UN or international courts, then you see a clear reason why this is occurring in the status quo. And I say that I continue to do what's probable and continue that the other 7 countries who also want total restriction on Muslim immigration have absolutely plausible reason to do so. Because unless international courts take action, then your argument has no standing. But then you go to this idea of scope and magnitude, and you're saying, well, if some people are persecuted, it's okay because it's their own choice. But that's going to lead me to my third contention, and that's the idea of the brain exodus. So essentially what immigration rules do right now is they only accept immigrants who are qualified, right? That's going to go towards your evidence saying, well, in Sweden, we took qualified immigrants who have some sort of specialization, and they help the economy. But what does that do to the Islam areas? The problem is that 75% of the recent immigrants in the last 2 years have been male. And this is even more problematic because 87.14% of them are from the ages of 18 to 34. You are taking the male working class from Islam areas and bringing them into European countries. And that's a problem because of the fact that they're the ones who are supporting their households. But even more importantly is you're taking these specialized people, right? These are 2 completely different arguments now, right? If you want immigrants to better the society, you're going to need the specialized ones who promote the workforce. That's a problem because then they're leaving their areas and they're leaving themselves in economic deplorability because the heads of households are leaving and going to Europe. And if you're talking about refugees, then they don't do anything because they don't have a specialization and they don't have economic standing, which is why 3 European countries have outright banned them. If they can't support themselves within a nation, Britain, France, and Italy says you're not allowed in our country.
All right, so it appears that my opponent's case has come down then, because his only response to defending his contention 2 was contention 3. So his contention 3 is all that his case now stands on. He says that it hurts Islamic countries for their lead men to come to Europe. Well, I have 2 responses to this. My first response is that of war. If you don't want your lead people to go to another country, don't allow there to be warfare in your country that requires them to leave. The reason why the top men from Syria are leaving is because there's war in that country. That's entirely up to the country's own government to fix its own problems. It's not Germany's problem to fix the fact that there are refugees coming to Germany from Syria. That's not Germany's fault. That's Syria's fault. If my opponent wants to fix this problem, have Syria do it. That's the answer here. And my second response is that of refugee choice. Again, this is about refugees fleeing from war-torn areas. This is their choice as an attempt to live a better life for themselves and their family. I simply cannot understand why my opponent would think that this is the reason why you would ban someone. So let's talk about Europe as a whole then. Can Europe benefit? And the answer is absolutely. Now, I already talked about several pieces of evidence, but let's look at Jonathan Portes, professor of economics at King's College, saying, quote, Europe should not only accept refugees, but welcome the consequential increase in the labor force. The migrant crisis represents an opportunity for Europeans to jumpstart the continent's economy. Economists tend to see a large influx of refugees not as an obligation or a threat, but as an opportunity. It is undoubtedly true that the economic case for immigration of refugees is strong, end quote. I had started reading this in the last piece, but I ran out of time. But Michael Clemens, a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, said, quote, there's not any credible research that I know of that in the medium and long term that refugees are anything but a hugely profitable investment, end quote. So clearly this is beneficial to Europe. It is beneficial to the refugees. And honestly, it's their choice. My opponent is trying to ban them from being able to come, but let them choose that. If it's so bad for them, let them decide. Ultimately, what we have here is a huge advantage for the countries of Europe and for the refugees who get a chance to flee from their war-torn areas. I cannot understand how my opponent thinks that sending them back to those war-torn areas is somehow better for them. That makes no sense to me at all.
All right, so the weighing mechanism here is that Europe should impose harder restrictions. So you're doing what's in the best interest from Europe. And that's going to go right down the flow on the first contention where I tell you the entire reason that 55% of Europeans want Muslim ban is for the idea that there have been 17 important credible terrorist attacks in the last 3 years directly because of immigrants. We saw it in Nice, we saw it in Germany, we've seen it in Sweden, and we've seen it in Istanbul. There's a correlated reason as to why Europeans don't want immigrants in their country. If they were just going to come in and improve the economic situation, as your evidence hypothetically conjures, then Europeans would have no problem with it. But the reason is because they belong in their country and they don't want Muslims who have a possible terrorist attack or possible terrorist threat to be in their nation. That's why majority of them want them outright banned. So then this goes to the weighing mechanism, which is economic profitability versus safety, right? If your majority of Europeans want them banned and the UK government, the France government, the Italy government, the Istanbul government agrees that they pose a threat, that's the reason why they're banning them outright. Your evidence indicates that in general, refugees are good. They might come in, take some jobs, improve the economy. First of all, in the last 3 years, the economies of any of these nations except Sweden hasn't improved significantly because of immigration. You never read evidence as to how the specific economy improved directly because of immigration. But more importantly, I would say 17 terrorist attacks caused because of Muslim immigration is a massive impact as opposed to, well, you can improve the economy, right? We're weighing two tangible things here. Is if you allow these people in, you pose a threat. Even if it doesn't occur, you create Islamophobia within the country because the people resent the Muslims getting in, and the Muslims have less opportunity because people don't want to hire them, right? Your entire evidence fails on the idea that refugees in general are good. But when you specialize it down to Muslims and there's an Islamophobia threat, these people aren't going to be hired. These people aren't getting jobs, and these people aren't promoting the economy. So insofar as there is a fundamental flaw as the evidence as to relating to the specific scope of the debate, I see no economic profitability, but I do see a direct terrorist threat that the European people believe in. And insofar as there's no other voting ground as to what you should do that's probable for Europe, I see a clear AF ballot.
All right. So it's interesting that in my opponent's last speech, he essentially conceded the fact that the economy will be significantly better off through allowing refugees. So it is now a discussion of economy versus safety. Now let's talk about safety. Talk about how there have been 16 terrorist attacks. Well, I'll refer you to a study by the University of Warwick and the University of Essex, which said that, quote, the findings also highlight that migrant inflows per se actually lead to a lower level of terrorist attacks. This research significantly improves our understanding of international and domestic terrorism as critical implications for the scholastic approach to terrorism as well for countries' immigration policies worldwide, end quote. Now, let me explain why this would be. When you have a steady flow of migration, you are enabling people to be part of their new country. So if they have information that could lead to a potential terrorist being found out, they actually care enough to report it. So it's what actually leads to terrorism going down. Enabling refugees is a benefit for terrorism overall. Now, he also talked about how the reason you ban it is because Europeans are scared. So again, we come back to this whole idea of populism. We're not doing policy for populism's sake. We do policy if it is the best option. So let's talk about the options now. On the one hand, we have a clear economic advantage. These are people who contribute economically to society. Every single study that we've looked at has shown that they both have benefited the economy and that they can continue to benefit the economy because they purchase things, they work, they have jobs. These are all contributing factors to the economy. And when you bring in new blood, it brings in new people buying new things, finding new innovation. That's how economics works. This is why immigration is significantly beneficial to the economy. We've seen numerous studies on this. It's a clear advantage for the con. Let's look at terror and crime. If it was supposed to be crime versus economy, well, even crime actually also goes to the con because crime and terror are benefited by having immigrants around. Having these refugees, it leads to a lower amount of terror. And then finally, we have population, which he still hasn't touched on. Europe is facing a demographic winter, it's been called. Within the next decade, they will have a population growth of 0. So they need refugees, they need immigrants to come in and be able to bolster them. Because if they were to have a population growth of 0, or even at the low amount that they're currently at, their economy will collapse. You need these refugees. So from the perspective of Europe, it's a clear advantage to Europe to have these refugees coming in. And even from the perspective of the refugees, it's a clear advantage for them to come in, first of all, because it's their choice. Second of all, because they're fleeing from war-torn areas. I once again refer you back to the point of human rights. So on a weighing mechanism, I mean, just in every single way, the con is winning this round.
The flaw is that I don't say I'm restricting immigration outright. I'm just saying I'm restricting Muslim immigration. So all your effects of economic benefit flow to my side, right? Immigrants are still coming into Europe. You're still promoting the economy. I also tell you that if you allow more you tell me that if you allow more immigrants, you're going to have better fertility and better population. Great. As long as it's not Muslims and more immigrants coming into Europe, all your impacts flow into my side. Remember, I define the scope of the debate, and that's Muslims, and you agreed to that, which is why you dropped all arguments of international courts, because I tell you the burden of proof falls on you. 3 countries have done it, and there hasn't been any international court stopping them, and thus we do what's probable, and we say the other 7 countries continue to do what's probable. So the way you vote in this round is the idea that Muslims, first of all, pose a terrorist threat to Europe, and that's a bad thing because Europeans don't want them there. They're not going to hire them for the same opportunities as your general evidence is going to read. But you also increase the Islamophobia threat by 400% in France. You saw 800% in Germany, and you saw several 100% within Britain. And you also see that you have a brain exodus within the Islam community. For those reasons, I see AF.
All right. So my opponent says that he should win the round because all of my impacts go to him. Well, I would respond that on a net beneficial level, all of them still go to me. Yeah, I'm not saying that all immigration is happening here, but when you have more immigration, you have more of the advantage. If he gets rid of the Muslim part of that immigration, he loses that part of the advantage. None of those impacts go to my opponent. all of them go to me. So when we talk about the multitude of different advantages here, when we have lower levels of terrorism by bringing in such refugees, that has been just proven. When you have lower levels of economic advantage, when you have more economic advantage, that's what happens when you bring in refugees. When you have more population, that's a part of the advantage. That goes to the con. All of these things are going to the con. My opponent has nothing to stand on except populism, which is that Europeans were scared. And yet all of the actual facts in this round belong with the con, as we see that it has been benefited to have more refugees because that lowers the rate of terrorism. It benefits the economy, it benefits the population, and it is a human rights abuse to restrict them in the first place. The clear reason to vote con.